The definition of the critical race theory is an analytical framework that stems from the field of critical legal studies that addresses the racial inequalities in society.
Okay, so next we have the explanations of the origin and focus. As a scholarly movement, critical race theory began in the early 1970s with the early writing of Derek Bell, an African American civil rights leader and the first black to teach at Harvard Law School. Writing about entrance convergence as a means of understanding Western racial theory and the conflict of civil rights in civil litigation. Bell was one of a small but growing group of scholars and minority activists who realized that the gains of the heady civil rights era had stalled and indeed were being rolled back.
Typical questions of our theory include: what is the significance of race in contemporary American society? Another one is: where and in what ways does race appear in dominant American culture and shape the ways we interact with one another? Third, what type of texts and other cultural artifacts reflect perceptions of race? Fourth, how can scholars convey that racism is a concern that affects all members of society? How does racism continue to function as a persistent force in American society? How can we combat racism to ensure that all members of American society experience equal representation and access to fundamental rights? And lastly, how can we accurately reflect the experiences of victims of racism?
Key terms and definitions. White privilege refers to the various social, political, and economic advantages white individuals experience in contrast to non-white citizens based on their racial membership. These advantages can include both obvious and subtle differences in access to power, social status, experiences of prejudice, educational opportunities, and much more. Microaggression refers to the seemingly minute, often unconscious instances of prejudice that collectively contribute to racism and the subordination of racialized individuals by dominant culture. Institutionalized racism refers to the systematic ways dominant society restricts a racialized individual or group's access to opportunities. These inequalities, which include an individual's access to material conditions and power, are not only deeply embedded in legal institutions, but have been absorbed into American culture to such a degree that they are often invisible or easily overlooked. Social construction refers to the notion that race is a product of social thought and relations. It suggests that race is a product of neither biology nor genetics, but is rather a social invention. Intersectionality and anti-essentialism. Intersectionality and anti-essentialism. These terms refer to the notion that one aspect of an individual's identity does not necessarily determine other categories of membership. So for our visuals and symbols, we chose the Ku Klux Klan because they represent racism and hatred. We chose the Confederate flag because it represents white power. We chose the Black Panther fist because it represents unity within the black community. We also chose the Black Lives Matter movement because it's an activist movement fighting against violence and systematic racism towards black people.